My name's Susan Payne. I'm the Executive Director of the State Ag Development Committee, and this morning's webinar is on the new special occasion events law that was recently passed. So we want to welcome you and thank you for attending. A couple notes. First of all, Jess Utel on our staff is kind of running logistics here. So if you have any technical issues, you can please message Jess. And Dave Kimmel is going to be the point person for SADC on all things special occasion events, and he is also on the call. He will be taking notes and he will be reading your questions. If you have a question, please post them to the chat and we can pick them up and Dave can relay those so we can address them during the presentation. The presentation today is being recorded. We intend to post this presentation to our website so that the information that we convey today can be shared with the public from here on out. So without further ado, I think we'll get started. So as many of you know, the special occasion events law passed, was signed into law in February. Let's see if I can get this to advance. That would be good. There we go. So the law became effective February 3rd, and the law to allow special occasion events on preserved farmland, it amends the Ag Retention and Development Act. So for those of, I think everyone on the call is familiar with the Ag Retention and Development Act. It's basically the foundational legislation creating the Farmland Preservation Program. So this law amended that legislation. And the goal here, as recognized in the law's text, was really to help, kind of increase the opportunity for ag tourism on preserved farms, and in doing so really help sustain the ag industry and improve profitability for preserved farms, right, and viability. But the goal here is to make sure those things happen in a way that does not displace the agricultural use of the land. This is not supposed to like take the place of agriculture, right? This is supposed to be something to help those farmers become more sustainable, right? And certainly not to disrupt surrounding neighborhoods. I think these are the two big concerns that some folks have about the implementation of the law. In fact, these are things that the SADC needs to report on to understand whether we're successful in running the program, in a way that doesn't displace agriculture and does not disrupt surrounding neighborhoods. So these are two key points that all of you, if your organization holds easements, if you're the grantee in any SADC farmland preservation easement, these are going to be important to you as this rolls out, right? So let's talk about what is an SOE. It's defined in the statute, and I'm not going to read all of these slides, and you'll have all of these, of course, available to you to refer back to. But for some of these points, it's really important, and I will read. So this is SOE is a wedding, lifetime milestone event, or other cultural or social event conducted on a preserved farm that is a commercial farm, and we'll get to the meaning of that language in a little bit. SOEs do not include, first of all, and importantly, activities that are eligible for Right to Farm Act protection, right? SOEs are not created to allow farmers to do agricultural activities, right? So if an activity is eligible for the Right to Farm Act, protection under the Right to Farm Act, that's not an SOE. SOEs are specifically non-agricultural in nature. An SOE is also not a recreational use that's already permitted on preserved farmland under the deed of easement, right? So this isn't trying to come in and add an additional limitation in any way. It's actually providing an additional opportunity. So, and we'll talk more about that in specifics later as well. And specifically, weddings held for owners, operators, employees of the commercial farm. So, when a property owner wants to use their farm to have a a family wedding, that's not going to be considered an SOE. This is really more of a commercial use of the property. So what is very important to understand is that landowners cannot just say, oh, I'm having this event under the SOE law, right? They must come in first and obtain approval from the grantee. And that grantee is almost always either a county, right, through our county easement purchase program, or it's a nonprofit under the nonprofit program, or it's held directly by the SADC through our direct program. When we acquire easements directly from landowners, then the SADC is the grantee. We have a small number of farms in the state that are held by municipalities, and we'll be reaching out to those municipalities specifically to make sure they understand their role here. But what's critically important, the takeaway here is that the grantee is the entity who's going to review and approve these requests for special occasion events. And what's interesting, if your organization works with us regularly, oftentimes, county or nonprofit review is required first, right? Like somebody comes to divide a farm and the county or the nonprofit, whoever holds it, they may approve it locally, but then it comes up to the state for approval as well, right? That's the normal farmland preservation model. That is not the case here. The grantee is the entity to review and approve the SOE. Your approval does not come to the SADC for a second review and approval. Okay, so this is a very locally driven legislation and process. And it's important to understand that holding an SOE without having obtained your approval is a violation of the deed of easement, and it's a violation of the law. And so it's very important that farms that want to hold weddings and, antique shows or whatever kind of festival that's not protectable under right to farm, that they come and get your approval. If they proceed on having events without your approval, that will not be good for them. So the application and review process is pretty straightforward. So who can apply? So either the owner or the operator of a preserved farm, okay? So it doesn't need to be both, it's one or the other. The preserved farm must also meet the definition of a commercial farm, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Right now, in order to acquire, in order to be considered a commercial farm, a farm has to produce a certain amount of agricultural or horticultural product, right? Which is all laid out in the Right to Farm Act. And they're just lifting that definition and they're using it here. That's the extent of the connection between right to farm and special occasion events. But importantly, if you have a piece of property, if you have a farm that qualifies for farmland assessment exclusively based on either woodland management plan or having a forest stewardship plan, those properties are not eligible for SOEs. Okay, so this is a definition straight out of the statute. This law, I think, was intended to support the operation of, commercial farm-based, tillable ag production-based farms. And so the legislature excluded farms that get farmland assessment based entirely on woodland management or forest stewardship, okay? And then that preserved farm must produce agricultural or horticultural products worth $10,000 or more annually. That's not a very high bar. Most farms have no trouble whatsoever demonstrating that, but that is the minimum production that must be occurring on that preserved farm in order for someone to hold an SOE. And if the farm operator, the person who's leasing the farm from the landowner, if it's the operator who wants to apply to hold an SOE, let's say I'm renting, your farm and I grow soybeans and I want to hold a wedding in the barn, that's fine. The operator can apply, but they would need written authorization from the property owner to make that application. Okay, we couldn't possibly have someone renting a piece of property, not keeping the owner in the loop, because surely there will be some liability exposure for holding SOEs, so the property owner has to completely be supportive and authorize the application. So the application and review process is again pretty straightforward. So the statute says that the grantee, that being you, if you're the nonprofit or the county, is required to, quote, develop an application process that allows it to obtain the information on the proposed SOEs. The SADC has developed a sample application form for you, and that is posted to our website so that every county and nonprofit doesn't have to recreate the wheel. So we've tried to develop some documents that'll help you get this process off the ground. So you review and confirm that this farm is eligible, that it's a commercial farm, that it produces $10,000 or more annually in ag products, and all of the other criteria laid out in the statute, and we'll walk through those. The SADC's developed a really easy to use tool that you can utilize to kind of confirm someone's $10,000 worth of production, and we'll get to that a little bit more in detail as well. Important thing to note here is that, let's say a landowner is going to have, gee, I want to have 6 weddings on my farm this year, right? They don't need to submit 6 separate applications, right? The grantee cannot ask for an application more than once annually, okay? And we'll get into that, but it's a really important thing to realize. And this is what I've said. So let's say initially a landowner may come to you and say, hey, I want this approval to have these 6 weddings. And you're like, great, you meet all the criteria and you issue an approval. And you say, okay, here's your annual approval, and then come back to us next year, right? And maybe the next year comes around and you're like, wow, this has been great. There's been no complaints and seems to be really working well. You know what, landowner, we're going to give you approval, but you don't have to come back for 2 years, So it's up to the grantee how often you want the landowner to have to apply, but you cannot require them to apply more than once a year. So with regard to this $10,000 production requirement, you could accomplish this in a lot of different ways. You could say, you know what, we really want to see your farmland assessment forms, as approved by the township as evidence of your income, or the statute would allow you to accept simply just an attestation, right? So if you're like, yeah, we don't actually want to get in anybody's books, if you want to accept a landowner's attestation that they produce that much, you can, okay? But again, it's kind of a locally driven process, so you have some flexibility in how you do this. What the SADC provided, because we understand, this law is intended to give people another opportunity, and we're trying to make it, and the legislature, I think, wants us to make it as unencumbered and kind of straightforward and streamlined as we possibly can, right? So what we did is provided and developed this little super easy to use really spreadsheet, and this has been posted to our website, and you can easily access this as well. And so what we've done is broken down the basic kinds of farms that we have in New Jersey, and using data from NASS, from the National Ag Statistics Service, we've filled in what the typical kind of most conservative value per acre based on those different things. So at a vegetable farm, this is a NASS data. This is kind of the minimum ag production value. You can see fruit, obviously a much higher number. Wineries, grapes, we don't have a number for that one. Nursery products, of course, probably being the highest thing in New Jersey. So as you can see, all of these different values have been filled in based on the national data. So a really simple way for you to check would be to say, oh, I have a landowner who's got, 100 acres in vegetables, and then you would fill in the number of acres, and it would produce a number which shows that clearly the landowner produces, that value. So this is kind of a quick and easy way to do it. Now, if you have a landowner that said, wait, I have a super high value crop like cannabis, and that it doesn't fit on your sheet, there is no value for that, the landowner could supply documentation to you to satisfy that you're satisfied that the $10,000 production requirement is evidenced, right? So we've provided this as a quick and easy way to do it, but you are certainly within your rights to ask for other documentation from the landowners, okay? Or operators, depending on who the applicant is. A couple other important things. This is very important. A farm must be in compliance with the Farmland Preservation Deed of Easement to be eligible to hold an SOE, okay? So if you've had a property where you're like, well, there's been major erosion going on and we've sent you notices for the last 2 years saying, look, this needs to be repaired, or somebody's been, illegally parking buses on the farm and you're like, you know what, that's gotta leave, that's not permitted. If you have any outstanding violations, those landowners are ineligible to apply. So this is a nice incentive for people to, resolve any compliance issues they may have so that they can become eligible for this opportunity. And the counties and the nonprofits do not have the authority to give an SOE approval if the property is not in compliance. Okay, so this is a very important threshold review factor for you. Is the property in compliance? So hopefully you've been doing great on-site inspections, and if you've raised issues with landowners in the past, they've resolved them and you can move on. But certainly those in violation are not eligible. So the farm owner or operator, I'm going to call him the applicant, submits the application to you. You review the application. The grantee has 90 days to review that application for adherence to the law. And I would say that would be 90 days from the submission of a complete application, right? Somebody can't give you a form that's not filled out and have the clock start ticking. So from our perspective, the clock starts ticking when you have a complete application. If you don't respond as the grantee within those 90 days, the application is deemed approved. Okay, so this is very important that you hop on it and take care of it. And the grantee, needs to take action. So how are you going to, document that action? We're recommending that there's a formal approval document with any conditions as necessary. That may be in the form of a resolution. If you're a county board, it may be a document approved by the nonprofit. I don't know if nonprofits pass resolutions, so these may have different forms, but there does need to be some kind of formal approval, because if you have a condition, it needs to be written down somewhere, right? So that we don't get into, well, they never told me I needed to do that kind of he said, she said stuff down the road. And then once you issue your approval, a copy of that approval has to be submitted to the SADC for our records. It's kind of interesting how the law pertains to nonprofits. So let's say a county, whether it be the county commissioners or the CADB, gets an application. If that application complies with the law, all the provisions in the law says that the county shall approve the application. So it's not very, it's not up to your discretion. Basically, if you have a landowner who complies, you have to approve it, all right? That same language is not in place for nonprofits. Nonprofits have greater latitude. So the statute says that the nonprofits can approve with conditions, or deny the application. And I won't go into all the justification for that, but that's the explicit language of the statute. So nonprofits certainly have more discretion whether to approve an application or not. So question, can the easement holders accept and approve applications prior to the SADC adopting rules? So yes, the statute explicitly says that landowners can apply right away, even though the SADC has not yet adopted regulations. We will adopt regulations, and once we do, all SOEs would have to comply with that. So we would recommend when if you're in a position of having to review and approve an SOE application prior to the SADC promulgating rules, we would recommend you include a provision in that approval. It says, here's your approval, but should the SADC adopt regulations, in the future, you're going to have to comply with those regulations just to protect yourselves. Okay.
Susan?
Yeah.
There were a couple of questions about the process before moving on to the next section about from New Jersey Conservation Foundation. The first one I think you answered about how nonprofits have a little more leeway in reviewing and approving or not approving applications. The second one was, can the SADC elaborate on the guidance offered by NRCS with respect to whether the new law generally or regarding holding of a special event, occasional events that would violate the federal farmland conservation restriction associated with properties that are subject to those restrictions. I think the question is asking guidance about farms that have federal funding as part of preservation.
Okay, and we have a slide on that, I'm pretty sure, so we will get to that question. Okay, so let's talk about the number of events. So the law says that as long as the farm is producing at least $10,000 of agri-hort production, they can hold up to 26 special occasion events per calendar year. And of those 26, 6 may have 250 guests or more. Okay, so this was like, somebody may want to have some kind of a festival, right? As an SOE, which is completely permitted so long as they comply with everything else in the statute. But I think this limit was intended to make sure that folks weren't having a festival, every weekend during the summer, right? So this 250 person, this guest cap is intended to make sure there's not an overproliferation of very large events, right? And if an applicant's holding more than one special occasion event on the same day, only one of those events can have 100 or more guests. And when we say guests, we mean number of people in attendance at any given time. So it's not like 250 people throughout the whole day, but it's like at any time during the event, if you are likely to have 250 people or more, then it's considered one of those larger events. All right. This was intended to allow, so like, let's say, hey, I'm having an antique car show that starts at, 2 o'clock this afternoon, but somebody wanted to have a kid's birthday party in the morning, right? So that can be accommodated as long as the birthday party in this case doesn't have more than 100 guests, okay? And then special occasion events lasting more than one day. So under the statute, and I recommend all of you, if you represent someone who holds an easement, to read that statute forward and backward. It's pretty clear. It's very specific language, so, and not hard to understand. So, but this is one of those little things, right? So the special occasion event, you can have a situation where one SOE actually occurs on 2 consecutive days. So let's go back to my antique car show example. If a landowner advertises, hey, we're going to have an antique car show, April 4th and 5th, the weekend, whatever, as long as it's marketed as a single event and it occurs on not more than 2 consecutive days, that is considered one SOE. All right. But if they said, hey, we're going to have an antique car show, like, every weekend in September, that is not one SOE, right? That would probably be 4 SOEs if you had it on 4 weekends, okay? So that's important when calculating how many events can somebody have. So for the nonprofits, this applies to all farms. So if the special occasion event is held by or for a nonprofit, do not count toward that 26 limit, event limit if the following applies, right? The event has fewer than 100 guests, The farm does not charge or receive fees or compensation for hosting the event other than a maximum $1,000 reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses. So, for example, right, if a farm wanted to say, geez, I want to host my, a fundraiser for the local fire company, right? And that fire company met the definition of a nonprofit, and there were less than 100 people there, and the farm was like, we're not charging you to come and use the farm, but geez, we did, rent a porta potty for you, so we want to get reimbursed those out-of-pocket costs up to $1,000. Then that kind of event doesn't count. This is like, hey, my daughter's Girl Scout troop wants to have an event here, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Or even if it wasn't your daughter, just like, oh, the local track team wants to have a fundraiser, right? So that was the intent here, to let people use a farm for small scale, nonprofit, not a money-making thing. So that's important too. So important carve out. And the law has a definition of what is a nonprofit for the purposes of this exemption, and it's defined in the New Jersey Nonprofit Corporation Act, and that's referenced in all of the materials we'll talk about later. So let's talk about how much of the farm can be used. So this is called the occupied area, and it includes, so the event can occupy 10 acres or 10% of the preserved farm, and that's the premises acres, whichever is less, okay? So, so you max out at 10 acres. You can't use more than 10 acres, like even if you had a 500-acre farm, right? 10 acres or 10% of the farm, whichever is less. And it includes everything. So all areas that support the SOE. So parking, where your vendors are going, equipment, tables, sanitary facilities. Even if you use existing buildings, right? The area under that building would count as part of the occupied area. Tents, okay? So this is very all-encompassing. What it doesn't include is, let's say you have a wedding on the farm, and the occupied area is whatever, 6 acres, and it's all cool. They've got all their parking in the 6 acres, and that's where the event's happening. But if people want to take a walk on the farm, after the wedding, that doesn't count, right? That's just that's permitted under the current deed of easement. That sort of just recreational use of the property in its existing condition. So we're just talking about like all the infrastructure and the main activity. But if like taking a walk around the farm, we're not going to get, at least from the SADC's perspective, that kind of thing should not count. And the occupied area could be one contiguous large area, or it may be, well, we're going to have parking here, and then, but then, the tents are over here and they're discontiguous. That's possible too, as long as the total area meets that 10 acres or 10% threshold. And the landowner or the applicant needs to submit a map to you to be very clear about where this area is, right? And we can talk more about mapping. But of course, every one of these farms has a property survey, right? We know that we have a farm survey for every farm, and there's lots of online mapping. So in any case, landowner needs to clearly define for you where the occupied area is. So how can the farm be affected by an SOE? And it really should not. So the statute's pretty clear here. It says SOEs may not interfere with the use of preserved farmland for agri-hort production and have only minimal effects on the occupied area, designed to protect the ag resources, ensure the land can be readily returned to productive use after the event. So the idea here is, part of my hay farm I'm going to use for this event, I put some tents up, had my event, great, take the tents down and somebody could go right back to farming the land. That's the intent here. Things that would alter the land, alter the soil, for example, like let's say somebody wants to have a really cool mud run, you know, and they want to excavate out an area and fill it with water so people can go through and get muddy. That would not be permitted because that would be damaging the ag resource of the farm, okay? So very much intended to be a light touch on the property so that once the infrastructure is gone, you really wouldn't know it was there. One of the big questions through all the iterations of the drafting of this was, does the SOE law apply to exception areas? The answer to that is if the SOE is held entirely in an exception area, the SOE law has no effect on what happens in the exception area, okay? Landowners took exception areas for a reason. That was to give them flexibility of use. And this is not intended in any way to affect what happens in the exception area. However, if most of a special occasion event is occurring in the exception area, but some of it is kind of flapping over onto the preserve farm, then this law absolutely applies to those events on the area, at least on the land that's under the premises. Okay. With regard to structures, so what kind of structures can be used? So you can use a permanent structure. An SOE could use a house. It could use a barn. Inside, outside. So as long as if you're using a structure that's already on the farm, that structure must be at least 5 years old at the time of application, okay? Landowners are not allowed to build a new building to hold SOEs. So that's the test. The building has to be at least 5 years old to be eligible to be used in an SOE. So you cannot construct any new structures to host the SOEs. Improvements to an existing structure are limited to that required for protection of public health and safety. You know, it's possible that the township may say, well, if you're going to have this SOE, you absolutely have to provide some lighting right here, or you have to provide a ramp to get into this building, you know, whatever those requirements are, they are. And so, but what a town cannot do, or you can't allow, is for them to say, well, we'd like to see your parking area completely paved, you know, or put Belgian block curves in. Like, no, right? Minimum to protect public health and safety. And I just covered those examples. Temporary structures, so tents, canopies, all of that can be used. They just have to conform with Uniform Construction Code and the fire codes, okay? And then the limit on structures, temporary structures can only be used between April 1st and November 30th for hosting SOEs. Some other details in the bill about what can occur on the property. So utilities. So can someone run utilities to the farm in order to support special occasion events? So the answer to that question is electric service can be extended to the farm or expanded, and water service can be expanded or extended to the farm. Other utilities, including gas and sewer lines, may not be extended to the properties for holding SOEs. Parking areas. So the statute talks about using existing parking areas. So many farms have, you know, a farmstead complex, and they've got an area that's already super compacted where nothing grows. The statute encourages the use of those areas first. And then any additional parking areas have to comply with standards the SADC has adopted under the Right to Farm Act, which described temporary parking and how to treat temporary parking areas. So those standards are already on the books, easy to understand, and that's what the grantee would apply when reviewing the parking areas for a permit here or approval. Food service. So the point here is a farm cannot use holding SOEs as a reason to create a restaurant, okay? Some farms, however, that produce lots of fruits and vegetables and even meats already have a retail food license, right? They've already kind of established the ability to harvest their crops and they process them and they're able to sell them right there as finished products. So farms that already have a retail food establishment permit or license, they may use that in connection with the SOE. But if the farm doesn't already have one, it cannot try to establish a retail food establishment, in order to service SOEs. So I think this is really going to focus food provisions to be food trucks and caterers and stuff that's brought in from outside, but not creating commercial kitchens on farms just to have SOEs. Of course, any alcohol that's served must comply with all state and local laws and regulations. So this statute doesn't touch that. It just says you have to comply with all the existing laws.
Susan, we have a question regarding the occupied area before moving on to the next section from the Morris CADB. Can the landowner set aside an area of the farm if the events are going to be held regularly, like every other weekend? And can tents be left in place if the events will be held regularly, or do they have to be removed after each event?
Okay. Well, this gets into some of the detail that the SADC would have to delve into through rulemaking. So in the absence of rulemaking, I think a lot of this kind of a question is going to be at the discretion of the grantee. So your boards and organizations are going to have to grapple with those questions. We could certainly be here to kind of think it through for you, but the SADC can't really give you a definitive answer on some of these very detailed questions because we just haven't adopted rules yet. So I know that may be unsatisfying, but that's just where we are at the moment. So that's where we are. Anything else, Dave, before I move on?
That's it right now.
Thank you. Okay. So some under the Farmland Preservation Deed of Easement, there's been a standard provision regarding recreational use of the land, right? So farmers today, landowners today, can conduct certain recreational uses and just be compliant with the deed. So we do not consider those SOEs. That's just a deed provision. But recreational events that are not permitted under the deed, that is what you would need to seek a special occasion event approval for. All right. So the boards, again, are going to have to really focus very specifically on what does that deed of easement language say, and be able to distinguish these things. So I think we have an example here. Right. So standard deed of easement language says certain recreational uses are permitted and income may be derived from them, such as hunting, fishing, cross-country skiing, ecological tours, if they use the premises in its existing condition and do not interfere with the use of the land for ag production. That's the standard language in most deeds. And so SADC has interpreted that over the years to be like, yeah, you want to rent your farm out to a snowmobiling group or a cross-country, running group or whatever. You can do that because those are all using the property in its existing condition. But as soon as people have in the past, we have case law on this, have said, oh, I want to erect, bouncy this and that, and, for, let's say, paintball, we've said no, you needed to put porta potties in, you have all these blow up obstacles, you've created fencing. Those are not using the property in its existing condition. So we have denied those kinds of uses in the past. So I think those kinds of uses would be ripe for being used for an SOE. Okay. And of course, the deeds say any activities such as golf courses and athletic fields are prohibited. They're still prohibited. You can't get an SOE to, build a golf course or an athletic field. All right, so just a point of focus for you. When you get an SOE that is recreational in nature, you really need to stop and make sure that this isn't something that's so minor that it's already permitted, and that it actually needs an SOE permit. And again, we'll be glad to help you think these through and talk with you to give you some help in thinking it through between now and the time we adopt rules. So, these evaluations are going to be really case specific. And so I think we've developed some like a Q&A and guidance documents and whatnot. And we use the example of like goat yoga, right? So let's say a farm today says, hey, I want to have goat yoga in my barn. And literally people show up on a Saturday and they put their mats down and an instructor shows up and they do yoga, right? We would consider that using the property in its existing condition. So that's not a special occasion event. But if they said, hey, we want to have a yoga fest, and we're going to have trucks and we're going to have tables and there'll be vendors and people will be selling stuff, then that becomes a special occasion event, right? So it's like this continuum, right? And so you really got to pay attention to what's needed. If they need to bring in new things and erect new things out on the property, then it becomes an SOE. So I think one of the biggest things is going to be some farmers saying, hey, what I'm doing or what I want to do is protected under right to farm under the SADC's on-farm direct marketing AMP, and therefore I don't need an SOE permit, right, or approval. And so, like I said in the beginning, a special occasion event is an event that is not eligible for right to farm protection. So if a farm is conducting marketing related events that fit within the Right to Farm Act provisions, they don't count as SOEs. Those are legitimate agricultural marketing events. So what we're thinking is that if a farm, let's say I have a large fruit and vegetable farm and I grow lots and lots of pumpkins, and in the fall I usually have a pumpkin festival. We would consider that a straight up traditional marketing tool that is protected under the Right to Farm Act, right? So, but if that same farmer says, well, and I want to also have weddings, right? So you're going to have to distinguish between those two. The property owner or the operator is going to have to explain to you what kind of events they consider right to farm eligible and which ones they don't. And really the CADB in this case would have to issue right to farm protection, issue a site-specific ag management practice for the events that the operator is claiming right to farm eligibility for, right? And then the grantee could then deal with the remainder of the events as SOEs. Okay, so if you're doing both, you need to clarify what's what, and the only way to do that is to get right to farm protection for those events that are eligible for right to farm protection. Okay, so if you're a farmer that's doing both, you really need to spend some time and get with the CADB and help draw these lines. Okay, people cannot just assert right to farm protection. A farmer cannot just walk in and say, hey, I have right to farm for all these. Right to farm is something that you have to be granted, and so they're going to have to go through that process. All right. And for those CADBs on the phone, you guys are super familiar with all of this. For the nonprofits, maybe not so much. So just one slide on what kind of events are protected under Right to Farm. So the Right to Farm Act talks about protecting, conducting ag-related education and farm-based recreation. And then this language is very important, provided the activities are related to marketing the ag and hort output of the farm. So the SADC adopted this on-farm direct marketing AMP. It's in our regulations and it fleshes all of this out. So it's pretty easy to understand. And so we expanded on what the Right to Farm Act said to clarify. So there's ag-related education, farm-based recreation, and on-farm direct marketing. All of these right to farm protections are activities that occur that are directly related to and are accessory to the sales of agricultural production on the farm, right? So like I said, you grow all these pumpkins and gourds and you want to have a fall, festival to have people out and have music and whatever, food trucks, but you're selling your product. That is a kind of event that is more likely to be protected under right to farm, right? But if you grow soybeans and you want to have a fall event and sell pumpkins and gourds and have a fall festival, well, clearly you don't grow those things. And so that event is unrelated to you marketing your output. So that's a special occasion event. So this is very fact specific, which is why people can't just like walk around asserting what's what. If you want both, you have to get clear and get right to farm protection for those things that you're eligible for. So I won't go into all of the detail here. This is all in our on-farm direct marketing rules. But this connection between direct market sales of the output of the farm is really the key. And these are either farm-based or product-based. Very important language in the on-farm direct marketing AMP is that they occur seasonally or periodically. So somebody cannot have, marketing events every single weekend of, 8 months of the year and be eligible for right to farm. That would be highly unlikely. Okay, so I've given you kind of these examples of an apple farm. Wineries, I think, is going to be an interesting one. Of course, this whole special occasion event thing grew out of what was a pilot program for wineries. And it has now evolved from just applying to wineries to now applying to all preserved farms, right? So this is a very big expansion of that. And so in the winery world, someone's growing grapes, they are producing wine from their grapes, and they have a tasting room, where they're selling. That is all straight up right to farm eligible activity. They're just marketing the output. It's when things transition over into, okay, well, now we want to have a wedding in the barn, and some of my wine may be sold there, but not exclusively, right? And so it's now turned into something non-agricultural. So that's really what the SOE law is all about. Farm to table events, this is a really good example. So if you have a farm that grows a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, they may even grow livestock, and in the summer they want to have farm to table dinners. Well, if the CADB is going to review that, and if the food on the table is coming from that farm, that would be a totally legitimate activity for a farm to conduct under right to farm, right? Because they're marketing the output of their farm. Whereas, again, you may somebody who's growing corn or hay and they want to have, a farm to table event. Well, that's totally cool, but you need an SOE permit for that, right? Because you are not marketing the output of your farm in order to have that event. So fact sensitive, farm sensitive, and requires really close analysis. So let's talk about some of the administrative requirements. So the initial application, of course, they have to obtain your approval prior to holding them. And then at the end of the year, the landowner or the applicant is going to submit to you, the grantee, a certification, which certifies that here are the events we held, here's what kind of events they were, and here's how many people attended, at least, right? At least that amount of information. This is required under the law. So if landowners blow you off and don't want to submit their certifications, it would be grounds not to give them an approval the following year, okay? This information is so important because it will help the legislature understand, is the law a success? Is it working as it was intended? Or are there problems? Is it causing problems for towns? Is it causing problems for the farm operations? Like, is it working, right? So these certifications are critical to us. And that certification gets submitted to the SADC. Once you get it from the landowner, you're going to forward them to the SADC so that we can start to compile an understanding of across the state, what's happening, is this working? How many people are doing it, et cetera, et cetera. So certification process is important and it's not optional. And again, this is going to be up to you, but if you've given somebody an approval for the year, they're going to come back next year. You're going to have to review again and submit again. But I think that's a good process. I think it gives you the opportunity to work with a landowner, make sure the landowner is doing things as they're required to. And if it's successful, the next year, like I said before, you might say, hey, don't bother coming back to us next year. We're going to give you a 2-year approval. Okay. That's another piece of information the legislature is going to want to know. You know, did everybody require them annually, or did some go to 2-year, 3-year, whatever? Okay. So your role as the easement holder is to accept, review, and decide on these applications. You're going to forward any approvals to the SADC. I would say to you that even if you get an application and it doesn't comply with the statute and you deny it, we're going to want you to send that to us as well, again, so that we can collect information and report to the legislature. You're going to obtain the farm's annual certification forms we just discussed and forward them to the SADC. And so what we're required to do, the SADC is required to submit a report 18 months from the effective date of the law to the legislature to say, here's how it's going. And then we are required to annually update them. And I think it's every 4 years, do kind of a comprehensive deep dive analysis. So this information is critical and is required. This isn't optional on the part of landowners. It's not optional on the part of grantees. If you are processing SOE applications, you have to provide those documents to us so that we understand what's going on. Inspections, both the grantee and the SADC have the authority under the law to inspect farms at any time, including during an SOE, right? So maybe someone has submitted an application to you and you approved, 2 weddings because that's all they asked for. But golly gee, there's neighbors who are calling saying, hey, they're having these every weekend. You are authorized without actually giving notice to inspect these farms to find out whether they're compliant or not. So landowners need to be aware of that. And this isn't, this isn't intended to be like some heavy-handed police thing, but many SOEs occur on the weekends and in the evenings, which is not normal working hours. So that's why the statute addressed that. They said, the county and the state need to be able to actually go on and see whether compliance is happening, and sometimes that happens after 5 o'clock. Another big issue is what's the role of the municipality here? And again, I would encourage you to read the statute. This is the area I think we're going to get the most questions on, and hopefully you can flesh out some during rulemaking. But for the moment, here's what the statute says. So holding SOEs has to comply with all applicable state and local laws and regulations. And then it says, including but not limited to those concerning food safety, litter, noise, solid waste, traffic, and the protection of public health and safety. So that last provision is very broad language, right? But I have to say, I think it's fair to say that public health and safety comes first. This whole program will be unsuccessful if we have people getting hurt or increased accidents, as a result of these things. So, as a government agency, we're always going to advocate to make sure the public health and safety is ensured. So then the statute goes on to say a municipality may, not shall, but may require the submission of an application for a municipal review if the proposed special occasion event would either A, generate parking or traffic flow that could unreasonably interfere with normal traffic, or B, require expenditure of municipal resources or require municipal inspections. So these are very broad terms, but it's interesting that the statute said the municipality may review if these, right? So that does create some understanding that if the event is so small, you're going to have a birthday party for 25 kids in your barn, that may not require any municipal approvals, and it's not going to interfere with traffic. So So there's this threshold that they've created through this language. And then it goes on to say municipalities may not charge more than $50 to review that application. And the application may not require more information than the following: location of tents and structures, sanitary facilities, access and egress, parking, right? These are all the kind of bread and butter public health and safety stuff. Are the structures sound and proper? You know, is the sanitary waste being handled properly? And are people safe in parking and getting into and off of this event, right? Makes sense. Where music will be played, number of guests, and then it says any other information that may be a public concern and would be required of a similar event when conducted at a public park or other public venue. So I think the goal here is, some towns are so detailed, right, in what they require. I think the goal here was, here's a farmer, they want to use their barn for, you know, a dozen weddings a year. Are you really going to put them through the paces of, you know, very heavy-handed engineering reviews and all this? Like, some towns, we all know, can be pretty aggressive when it comes to requiring things. And I think the legislature is saying, look, we don't want the towns to be so heavy-handed that it doesn't even make financially sense for farmers to do this, right? So this language, I thought this last point was really important. It's like, hey, if the town was hosting, you know, whatever, Washington Township Day at the public park, what would the township be reviewing, right, to make sure public health and safety were protected? And I think the legislature is asking the towns to take the same approach with these kinds of events. Don't ask for things you don't need, you know, but ensure the public is protected, and that's a fine line to walk. But this is the amount of guidance we've been given, and we're going to have to work with it. But again, when reporting, when the grantees are reporting to the county, or back to the SADC rather, about how is this going, you know, this is the kind of feedback we want. This is the kind of information the legislature is going to want to hear more about. Is this working, or is this not working, right? So the statute doesn't say it, but we're going to recommend that once you receive an application from a landowner, that you send a copy to the town, right? Because the town has a right of review if the event will trigger these certain thresholds. And how are they going to know whether the thresholds have been triggered unless they have a copy of the application? So we think that's the only way this makes sense. The township needs to know the application's been submitted. So that's our recommendation, that you copy the town when you get an application and get them in the loop. And I will say to you up front that you're going to have different municipal attorneys who have different opinions about what that statute says. And, you know, so again, until the SADC can adopt regulations and try to put more flesh on those bones, you know, there's likely to be differences of opinion. But we will work with towns, and we will work with grantees, and we will work with landowners in any way we can to try to make this work as it was intended, right? So it'll be an experiment. Inspections and enforcement. Inspections we already talked about. Both the grantee and the SADC have the right without notice to inspect these events. Enforcement, the SADC is the agency responsible for enforcement. So the legislature basically laid out a process. And if, let's say you as a grantee are working with a landowner and you've raised concerns and they're not fixing them, and you really think there's a violation going on, you need to let us know. You should, we recommend you communicate with the landowner in writing so that you have a record of the concerns you've raised and what their response has been, and the timeliness of all of that. But if you feel, it's either going to be the grantee thinks violations are occurring, or neighbors, right? Somebody's going to dime this poor farmer out, and they're going to call our office, right? And so then we're going to have to get involved and say, well, what's happening, and what were the conditions of your approval, and what's, you know, so we're going to go into, well, what's the evidence, right? So if the SADC finds that a violation has occurred, the statute lays out an administrative process for us to notify the landowner of that, allow the landowner to request a hearing, go through a hearing process, and at the end of the day, the SADC can both fine the landowner and can suspend the landowner depending on the frequency of the violations. So the penalties, so the first violation is $1,000 penalty, up to $2,500 for the second offense, or $5,000 for a third or subsequent offense. Each day in which a violation occurs is considered a separate offense, so that can start to rack up pretty quickly. And then suspensions. If somebody has a violation the first time, the only thing we can do is fine them. But if they violate the law a second time, the statute says the SADC shall suspend the farm from holding SOEs for up to 6 months. Okay, so that's some discretion on the part of the SADC. For a third offense, we have to suspend them from 6 months to a year. And for a fourth or subsequent offense, we have to suspend them for at least a year or permanently suspend them. So those are, the suspension is a pretty, it's a pretty hard, treatment, right? And so the goal here is to work with landowners to get them to comply, to work with them and achieve compliance. We have no interest or desire to go after anyone here. So I'm hoping landowners will be good actors and, conduct their SOEs within the confines of the law. And if they don't, and either the grantee or the public raises concerns, then we're going to look into it and take it from there. So as to the question we got earlier, can SOEs be held on farms with federal funding? So we did reach out to the Natural Resource Conservation Service and ask that question. The answer we got back was yes, farms preserved with federal funding can apply to hold these SOE events. But the NRCS encouraged the grantee to pay very close attention to the language in the farm's federal deed of easement, right? Because the federal program is, 20 years old-ish. And the deeds have changed quite substantially over time, right? So it's not nearly as consistent as the SADC's state easement. The federal easement's changed a bit. So you really need to pay careful attention to what is in your federal deed, and then review that. And if you want to consult with NRCS, the state NRCS office would be glad to review your language with you, and you kind of walk through it and make sure they either agree or disagree with how you're interpreting the easement. NRCS review and approval is necessarily only when the easement terms require it, or in the event NRCS exercises its enforcement rights. So if you have federal funding on your farm, it does not necessarily mean NRCS needs to approve this. So I would really encourage you, if you have a farm that applies with federal money, that you engage our office and NRCS right at the beginning, and we can have a chat about what it says and whether they think it's permitted. And then if so, NRCS may step back and allow you to review the application in compliance with the deed. Okay, and again, this will be another kind of piece of that information. How did that go? Did NRCS work with us? I'm sure they will. But that'll just be an interesting point of, were federally funded farms able to get approvals, or were they not? If you are a county, the grantee in that easement is either the county, what used to be called the freeholder board, right? Now the county commissioners. Or it could have possibly been the County Ag Development Board itself, or possibly both, right? So whose responsibility is it? So again, the law requires the grantee to administer the law. So what we think is going to happen here is if a county board of commissioners is the technical grantee, the commissioners need to determine whether they want to delegate this review and approval process to the County Ag Development Board or not, whether they want this stuff to have to come before the freeholders, or sorry, commissioners, or whether they want to kind of kick this responsibility to the CADBs. So that'll be a county by county evaluation for who's going to review it at the county level. Okay, and so for more information, I don't have pictures of it in this presentation because I think the presentation was being done at the same time we were finalizing the documents, but on our website, we have for you a special occasion events overview. As many of you probably know, the SADC's spent a lot of time and effort to develop guidance documents on all aspects of our program that you can give to a landowner so they can understand it. So we have a guidance document on SOEs, and that really is a summary of really what I've talked about here today. We've also created a Q&A, special occasion events Q&A, that gets to some of these questions and answers. So we would really highly encourage you all to read these, share them with your board, and to kind of get everybody up to speed a little bit on the basics of the law. We've also drafted for you a special occasion events application form so that all of the counties and nonprofits aren't independently trying to do all this. So there's a comprehensive application form on our website. You are free to add to it or take stuff out of it. If you don't, if you don't like it, you're completely within your rights to develop something else. We just wanted to try to make this easy for you. So that's there. Also on the website is the estimator tool, that $10,000 income estimator tool. Super easy to use. And I think also on the website is a copy of the final Chapter 9 law. So in its final form, not the CV'd version, which is really hard to read. So, and it's not very long. It's what, 6-7 pages. Very straightforward. And would encourage you to share that also with your boards and with landowners who are interested in the program. Dave Kimmel, who's on the phone. Oh yeah, there's all the things that we've done. I just talked about. And Dave Kimmel will be the conduit for Q&A from our partners. So if you have a question after today's seminar that we haven't addressed, please direct your inquiry to Dave, and then he can funnel it up, and we make sure that we're all, singing from the same sheet of music here. There's our phone number, and we're glad to have questions from landowners, towns, grantees, whoever, whoever's looking for help on how to figure out how to move forward. Please get in contact with us, and we'll help you if we can.
Susan, so we had one more. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to relate one more question that came in from NJCF when you were talking about the administration of the law and the potential municipal role, how we recommended that grantees submit a copy of the application to the municipality so that they're aware of it. The question was, what about making that notification requirement something that would be the applicant's responsibility?
Yeah, you are within your right. This is, like I said, very driven by the grantee, right? The statute says the grantee is to establish an application process. So if you want to make the landowner or the applicant's responsibility to send a copy of their application to the municipality, you may absolutely do so.
That's the only question that we have right now in the chat.
Okay. Are there any other questions? All right, not seeing any. I just want to say to everyone that I think this could be a really great thing for agriculture. I think it could be a great thing for tourism. And it would certainly be a great thing for the public, you know, to be able to access preserve farms and enjoy them more, right? So in the spirit of that, we're going to work really hard to make sure this can work and really encourage landowners to comply. You know, I think we're going to be there to support good actors who are trying to comply, and that's the goal. We have no interest in taking enforcement action, but we will if we have to. And again, this is a little bit of an experiment, right? This is new, and we're going to learn a lot. So particularly in the next year or so before the SADC adopts regulations, this first year or two, the information that you convey to us through copies of the documents and anything else you want to tell us in your submissions is really important and will inform the rulemaking process. So this is really our opportunity to work together to get this right. And so I just, you know, very genuinely want to extend that offer and hope that you participate, you know, fully, and that because it will really affect the outcome long term. And so this is kind of an exciting time for us, and we really hope it can be a success for everyone involved. So with that, since there are no other questions, I'm going to let you all go early and hope you have a nice